while Taiwan sits at the center of the Sino-Japanese dispute, it rarely gets to speak for itself. The Communist Party has never shown even a tiny bit of respect for the political views of Taiwanese people. How terribly must a mother treat her child for that child to sever the relationship so decisively? Unification has to be achieved through separation. Last month's diplomatic clash between China and Japan once again exposes Taiwan's deeply awkward position on the international stage. Through the Chinese Communist Party's diplomatic rhetoric, we see not confidence, but a fundamental disrespect for differing political views. This rigid, aggressive, and anti-pluralistic mindset does not stop at foreign policy. It seeps inward, directly shaping the living conditions of young people in China. Over time, it drains the entire society of its vitality, its creativity, and its will to move forward. The party is no longer governing history, it is composing its own apocalypse. This incident occurred more than a month ago and concerns the interpellation of Japan's Prime Minister Sanae Takaichi in the Diet. The context was a question from an opposition lawmaker regarding Takaichi's understanding of the legally defined concept of survival-threatening situation. As is well known, Japan has been subject to post-war constitutional restrictions, and the Japan Self-Defense Force are, as its name suggests, limited to self-defense and prohibited from waging war proactively. Against this backdrop, certain right-wing politicians argue that when a close ally or partner of Japan comes under armed attack, and that attack poses a secondary or indirect danger that could endanger Japan itself, Japan should, if the threat becomes severe enough to jeopardize its survival, be permitted to use force under the framework of limited collective self-defense. Takaichi is one of the prominent Japanese right-wing politicians who support this interpretation. Left-leaning critics, however, challenge the ambiguity of the standard and ask, under what specific circumstances would an attack on an allied or partner nation be deemed a threat to Japan's survival? The worry that if the government is granted broad discretion to define such a situation, it could enable an overly expansive use of force and, in the worst case, a drift back toward pre-war militarism, hence the controversy. When politicians discuss potential scenarios, the country most frequently cited is Taiwan. Japanese lawmakers are well aware of the Chinese government's stated intention to take Taiwan by force. Thus, the right wing's hypothetical framework maps neatly onto an existing geopolitical reality involving Japan, China, and Taiwan. It is against this background that Takaichi's remarks take on their full meaning. Her implication is that China might indeed attempt to annex Taiwan by force in the future, and that in the event of a severe Taiwan Strait conflict, Japan could determine that it has entered a survival-threatening situation. The subtext is the possibility of Japanese military involvement in a China-Taiwan war. Naturally, her wording remained vague. She could not openly declare that Japan would provide military aid to Taiwan, yet her stance was unmistakable. She envisions the Communist Party at its most aggressive to such an extent that Japan might feel compelled to deploy its forces beyond its own territory to safeguard national security. But can the CCP realistically be that aggressive? The scenario Takaichi seems to have in mind would require the CCP not only to invade Taiwan, but also to declare, or at least strongly signal, that Japan would be its next target. Only under such circumstances could Japan plausibly argue that an attack on Taiwan constitutes a genuine survival-threatening situation for the Japanese homeland. Yet such a scenario is, in my view, exceedingly unlikely. A Chinese invasion of Taiwan is possible. Let's just hope Xi Jinping does not pursue it. But it is far harder to imagine Beijing use Taiwan as a springboard for a further assault on Japan. If China were to attack only Taiwan, it could easily frame the operation as the resumption of the Chinese Civil War. In that case, Japan would find it extremely difficult to classify Beijing's move as a direct threat to Japan's survival. Therefore, Takaichi's eagerness to involve Japan militarily in support of Taiwan begins to look somewhat unreasonable. And what followed illustrates this clearly. Almost immediately after her remarks, the CCP took advantage of the vulnerability in her statements, accusing her of displaying a tendency to revive Japanese militarism and reiterating that the Taiwan issue is an internal Chinese matter in which no foreign state has the right to interfere. Strategically, the CCP won this round of diplomatic messaging. Although Takaichi expressing support for Taiwan, her pursuit of a Japanese right-wing ideological agenda left her on fragile moral ground, since many observers could see that her stance was less about protecting Taiwan or Japan than about expanding Japan's military autonomy under the cover of crisis rhetoric. But isn't it curious that while Taiwan sits at the center of the Sino-Japanese dispute, it rarely gets to speak for itself? Internationally, hearing Taiwan's perspective is very difficult. This is why this incident made me feel that Taiwan desperately needs a capable ally on the international stage, one that truly understands and sympathizes with its predicament. Japan could have that potential. Yet there is a catch. The Japanese government will naturally put its own national interest first, and the politicians like Takaichi are so absorbed in their right-wing ideals that genuine advocacy for Taiwan seems unlikely. It's more probable that Taiwan is being used as a convenient pawn to advance Japanese domestic political ambitions. So I've often wondered, if I were Takaichi, and if I wanted Japan to become Taiwan's true ally, what would I say to refute CCP's point? Let me summarize the current context. China's foreign ministry claims that Taiwan issue is China's internal affair, that Taiwan is Chinese territory, and Japanese inclination to deploy troops to Taiwan is an infringement on Chinese sovereignty and a prelude to the revival of militarism and fascism. My response would be, Japan's deployment to Taiwan is certainly not an invasion of Taiwan, but a military cooperation with Taiwan based on our national interests. What's important is not whether such military cooperation is actually possible in the future, but that the Japanese government is willing to engage Taiwan as an autonomous partner. This willingness itself shows that we respect the Taiwanese government, consult with Taiwanese society, and treat Taiwan as an equal political entity. In contrast, the Communist Party has never shown even a tiny bit of respect for the political views of Taiwanese people. The so-called Taiwan issue today exists precisely because you, the party, refuse to tolerate opinions that diverge from yours. So this is not Japan taking over Taiwan, it is Taiwan choosing whom to trust. You lost Taiwan's trust because you yourself failed to respect it, and you can't scapegoat anyone else for that. Yes, Japan once colonized Taiwan, and despite this history, Taiwanese cultural roots undeniably lie closer to China than to Japan, as Taiwan has had historical and cultural connections with the Chinese mainland for several centuries. Yet today, Taiwanese people feel more affinity for Japan than for the mainland. Why? Have you considered this? Reflect on what you have done. rather than constantly blaming outsiders. I know that in your propaganda, Taiwanese and Chinese people are often depicted as members of the same family, or that Taiwan is portrayed as a lost child in China's big family, with mainland playing roles of Taiwan's mother. If this analogy were accurate, how terribly must a mother treat her child for that child to sever the relationship so decisively? The CCP does use such melodramatic language in their propaganda. A few years ago, a propaganda video released by an official Chinese media outlet went viral online. In it, the host, speaking in a gentle, motherly tone, addressed the people of Taiwan. Wan Wan, come back home, please.
弯弯，回家吧。
If I were Taiwanese, I would have been scared off immediately. The manipulation is painfully obvious. It reads as, come back so I can exploit you further. That is not an affection, it's emotional blackmail. If one genuinely wished Taiwan well, one would say, Taiwan, go live your own life. I support you whatever choices you make and whatever political aspirations you pursue, since I truly believe you will make the right choice for yourself. Look, CCP, I'm literally showing you how to be a model parent. Do you seriously want some young adult like me to teach you what it means to be a proper parent? Maybe you actually need it because when the host said Wan Wan come back home, she clearly had no idea how abusive the CCP is acting as this mother or parent. Now let me step out of playing Mrs. Takaichi. There's also another very important reason why China should respect the independent views of the Taiwanese people instead of trying to force them to abandon those views. Pay close attention to this point, as I might well be the only person publicly expressing this idea. The point is this: even from the perspective of the CCP's own interests, the most strategically effective way to achieve unification between Taiwan and the mainland is to support the Taiwanese people's desire for independence. Unification has to be achieved through separation, following the same logic that it's only when you allow people to dislike and stay away from you that they can possibly like you and come closer to you. You got me? Please take a moment to think through this paradoxical idea and you will see what it really means. Imagine a narcissistic king who wants all his subjects to love him, so he makes not loving the king a crime. What will happen then? No one will love him. The harder he tries to force loyalty, the more he drives people away. The CCP is doing something remarkably similar. Within China, they have established institutions and campaigns supposedly aimed at promoting Taiwan's unification with the mainland. But in practice, these efforts rely on manipulating Taiwanese public opinion with money and punishing those labeled as Taiwan independence activists. The outcome is counterproductive. Instead of fostering unity, these measures only increase distrust. Ironically, the CCP itself has become the largest domestic force actually fueling Taiwan's desire for independence. If the CCP genuinely wants Chinese national unification to occur, and if those in power are sufficiently intelligent, they have to admit that the most effective strategy would be the opposite of coercion. The party should immediately assure the Taiwanese government that they can amend their constitution to declare independence without fear of military retaliation from the mainland. Beyond that, the CCP could help Taiwan restore its seat in the United Nations and formally acknowledge the practical reality of two Chinas. Imagine the consequences if the CCP truly did this. The Taiwanese people would feel genuine gratitude toward the mainland government. They would no longer see the need to look to Japan or the US for support or protection. Even with two Chinas existing, the trust established through China's compromise could form a strong foundation of political cooperation to facilitate continued economic, cultural, and diplomatic exchanges. The two sides could even establish a new political framework which could be a shared international representation of the new Chinese nation. However, many Chinese people can say with confidence that the CCP is extremely unlikely to pursue unification in this way. As for the reason, some say It's because recognizing the existence of two Chinas would directly challenge the legitimacy of the CCP's rule, and the party clearly wants to remain the sole authority governing China. There's certainly some truth in that. But after considering it for a long time, and in the end I arrived at a surprisingly simple conclusion. The reason the CCP is suppressing Taiwan's independence aspirations and refusing to acknowledge the existence of two Chinas is that Xi Jinping personally likes to do so. We must not underestimate the impact of Xi Jinping's personal will on China's politics today. Xi has already transformed China into a fully authoritarian, if not outright totalitarian state, where power is highly centralized in his own hands. Chinese officials at all levels have their promotions, policy implementation, and personal interests tightly tied to obeying the central leadership and Xi's intentions. Any actions that go against Xi Jinping's preference risk punishment. As a result, the whole state apparatus ultimately mirrors his personal decisions and priorities. At this point, the issue is hardly political at all. It has become a matter of Xi Jinping's personal preferences.